Howdy, Tom Raftican here, Santa Barbara Forum, sitting in for Mike Nicholson, your director, old friend, and really happy to do it. Normally you've seen me here doing South Coast Real News and real world conservation. It's a little bit different show. We're doing a little bit different. But again, it's, kicking off the other show, we talk about 38 million people in the state of California and how you have conservation that works for all of them. And really what it is an honest evaluation of what's going on and how do we wisely use resources. I've got a very special guest on the show though, and guest Bob Osborn is a CPA. He's retired. He's an old dear friend of mine. But Bob, over the years, on top of a number of different avocations, has done an incredible amount of work on climate change and actually taking a look at it from the perspective of a certified public accountant. Bob, welcome to Santa Barbara Forum.
Oh, thank you, Tom.
Hey, Bob, first of all, I'd like to go back, I think the very beginning. You have no financial interest at any point whatsoever in climate science or anything to do with or anything related with climate science.
No, I don't. This is entirely a hobby of mine, basically.
Exactly. All right. Well, I'm going to say it's not a hobby, it's a passion. I have to put up with it an awful lot. So, no, I'm serious. You've spent an incredible amount of time on that. But I want to, before that, I'd like to go back and kind of look at credentials a little bit, just to give our viewers some kind of an idea of your background. Your dad was in the air. He worked for space.
Yeah, Douglas Aircraft.
Douglas Aircraft. Okay, so there's kind of a scientific and I mean, airplane. If you get it wrong, it comes down. So I mean, there's real science there.
Yeah, actually, it runs pretty deep in both sides of my family. My grandfather was in aircraft, and so was both my grandfathers, and my father. In fact, my grandfather was around for the first manned flight, because he lived in Dayton, Ohio, and had a home right behind the Wright Brothers Cycle Company.
Okay, so this wasn't the first manned space flight. This was the first manned flight. Okay,
right.
Pretty cool. Like I said, I'm just trying to do this to kind of give our viewers some kind of an idea that the exacting nature of science that you've been exposed to. You were in the Air Force.
Yes, I was in the Air Force for 4 years, and after I got out of the Air Force, I went back to school for a while. Found a little difficulty finding a direction, but I was always interested in the outdoors, and so while taking a course in philosophy, I also took a lot of meteorology courses, and so for me, the kind of passion of engineering and stuff, it must be genetic because it runs so strongly through the family that I've always been curious about how things work.
Well, and you've got a construction background also.
Yes.
And tell me a little bit about that.
Well, I got into construction. Actually, I was working on fishing boats, and when the Arab oil embargo, I believe it was 1973, came along and made it really tough to get passengers to go out fishing because the cost of fuel had gone up so much, and the cost of everybody just didn't have the extra spending money to do that. So I got involved in construction, and then quite obviously because of the shortage of fuels and long fuel lines, there was a tremendous interest in alternative energy. And so I kind of directed my efforts down in that direction of how to build homes, how to add, say, solar energy things to those homes to, for water heating and then later space heating. And so I developed a good expertise. I worked with some of the leading radiant people installing radiant systems in homes, and read everything I could get my hands on. And it was interesting education in how solar energy works and how to collect it. Because basically, when we talk about the greenhouse effect, it is the sequestration of energy into the climate system from the sun that gives us the greenhouse effect.
I want to get to that, but I want to get to that in a second. You went back to school afterwards, finished up your degree, and graduated, became a certified public accountant.
Yes. Yes, I did. After I had a construction site injury, and I started down a course of looking to maybe take a job with a larger construction firm as a manager of some sort. And I went to Cal State Long Beach and took a business administration major, got nearly straight A's, and got a very good job with a leading CPA firm when I graduated.
What did you do with that CPA firm? Kenneth Leventhal?
Kenneth Leventhal Company, yes. And we concentrated on difficult to value assets, primarily large real estate projects. The first project I worked on as an apprentice was the valuation of an entire growing city. And
good, strong background there, but you're basically auditing this.
Right. Well, that's what I was being trained for at Kenneth Leventhal as an auditor.
Okay.
And so I went through there and got my CPA license, and then I pretty much migrated to consulting practice, management consulting from that.
Okay. But the background is you've got this background. What does an auditor do?
Well, an auditor, we're involved with private businesses primarily, and private businesses issue financial statements for the purpose of getting loans and also selling stock and things like that, and to fund the business activities. And so the documents they put out are called financial statements, and they're designed to inform potential investors as to whether or not you're a good risk to either give a loan to or invest in the company. And so essentially what we do is we look at the transactions of a company and determine if indeed they properly book profits and losses, and that their financial records fairly represent the condition of the company. And
you as a CPA have a stake in the work that you do.
Right, yeah. CPAs get paid by the company that they audit, and they also share in the risk. If, for example, you do an opinion on the financial statements and it turns out it's wrong, you're likely to get sued, and you'll be sued right alongside with the business owner.
Bob, that was kind of what I was getting to. There's a responsibility there, and outside eyes that can look at it, so that you have a duty to perform up to standard.
Yes, I mean, independence is the highest standard in terms of being a certified public accountant, is that you cannot have any other kind of interest in what you're opining upon. And so, the fees you get paid are a small portion of what type of risk that you're taking. It's a quite risky occupation if you make mistakes.
Okay, we're going to get back to this in a little bit, because if you're doing work on something, let's just say climate change, is there that same standard of care?
Well, with basically when you're dealing with the issues of climate change, you're dealing with academic institutions and governments do not have the same kind of liabilities that businesses have.
Okay, we'll kind of catch back up on that, but I just wanted to get it out there that you are highly accountable as an accountant. You're auditing. You have your own personal accountability in there also.
Yeah, I love figuring out how things actually worked out.
Yeah.
That to me it's a passion. I get attracted by YouTube videos all the time of how to do something that I never am going to do.
I hear you. Unfortunately, fortunately or unfortunately. The other thing is you're out there, you're working as an accountant, and then, the other thing, you and I got together, you're doing work after this with fisheries management. You and I have worked together over 20 years on this.
Right. You know, when I first got involved in fisheries management, it was because of my passion of fishing. I've been a lifelong private angler, and when I had a break between jobs at one point, I had, because I'd taken some time off to take care of my dad, I had an opportunity to volunteer for an organization that you ran. And as I started working on it, I realized that the skills that I had been attained were relevant to what I was doing for you in conservation.
I'm laughing. I'm just thinking back of Tom Sawyer painting the fence and saying, gosh, this sure is fun, painting this fence, ain't it? You and I have worked together because of this for over 20 years, and it's been a pleasure working with you most of the time. We do have disagreements, but you know, I think the thing that really attracted was the accuracy of your work. And that accuracy, when we were looking at federal fishery management programs and we're looking at destructive fishing gear, you know, it's allowed you to work with the Pacific Fisheries Management Council, their Highly Migratory Species Advisory Committee. I mean, you're there 15 years?
Over 20 years
20
now.
years now.
22 years, I believe.
Wow, longer than I wanted to remember. And again, the reason I bring this up is fishery management kind of sits a little bit outside of this thing, but the other thing is, you know, you look at very specific things, you look at very specific rules and how you apply those rules. And if you can do it in one scenario, you can probably do it in another scenario. So you've done a fair amount of looking at global climate change. Can you give us a little bit of background? We'll talk about the anthropogenic in a second, or it may come in. But you know, when we start looking at climate change, you know, climate changes. I mean,
yeah. What an auditor does, you know, you don't have, as an auditor, you don't have to be necessarily an absolute expert at what you are on the topic matter, and I don't pretend to be an expert at all the issues in climate, but the auditing is a process of gathering evidence and supporting suppositions, and you need to have some knowledge of it in order to do it. In other words, you need a background, you need to know the basics, you need to know
vocabulary,
right, vocabulary and things like that, and so that is a necessary part of it. I felt that my first interest in climate change was piqued because of talk about CO2 and comparing that to the experience that I had in construction of doing passive solar energy projects. And so that gave me a real interest. I said, okay, well, let me understand what they are talking about. So, because it kind of runs a little bit contrary to what my viewpoint of
your actual experience in the field
was in dealing with solar energy. Like I say, solar energy in a passive solar energy system is about collecting heat and preserving it within the system. And you know, there are very specific things you have to do that. And so you know, there's more than one way for that to happen. And convection is a key element in it, and radiation can be a key element of it. Generally speaking, radiation operates and makes you feel comfortable, hot or cold, depending upon how much you're radiating away. And how much you radiate away depends on how much the warmth of the things that are around you that are radiating back at you.
Bob, the thing that strikes me when you and I talk is you talk in terms of the known laws of physics. Okay, there's no hocus pocus here. It's like convection, conduction, radiation. These are the things that we know about. Let's apply them and look at the overall situation in terms of the known laws of physics.
Right. In looking at how our climate is the way that it is, there's no question that greenhouse gases have a role in that. And it's a very important role. If we could be sitting out there and the air temperature could be 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and we could be freezing to death because of the fact that there is nothing preventing us from radiating to space. And that'll be a feeling, not a temperature necessarily. The surface of our skin would be very cold, but the air around us could be very warm. And so the physics around that are pretty well understood. Where it gets confusing is in trying to split up things like within an atmosphere between conduction, convection, and radiation.
You know, I'm going to ask you a question here. I'm the neophyte. Is this a good time to take a look at what some of the natural trends have been in this?
Yes. The first thing you ask yourself as an auditor is you ask, is there support for the theory that is there? And I will say that there's a good deal of what you might say disagreement, mild disagreement to severe disagreement between scientists about exactly how the greenhouse effect works in detail. And so you can't get a consensus there, and an auditor would go, oh dear, you know, I mean, we've got an issue here, so, and we're booking, you know, a planning on so much warming, how can we support that? So the second thing that we would usually look at, we would look at historical change and temperature. And I brought a graph along here to implement that. It's a
graph number one?
Graph number one.
Michael, could you run that graph number one, please?
Now this graph is a graph of satellite temperature records from about 1990 to the present, and it shows that the satellite records here are showing that the warming that is actually occurring in the environment is a little bit less than half of that projected by the...
Okay, Michael, put that graph back up for a second, please. The jagged line on the graph, that's the satellite, those are the satellite
temperatures. Actually observed temperatures.
Those are observed temperatures, objectively observed, okay?
Right. And the red straight line and the reddish cone that surrounds it is the range of projected warming by folks that are trying to figure it out from the radiation effects of greenhouse gases.
Was that IPCC?
Yes, that would be the IPCC, which is a
so
UN.
These are the known scientists have, and it didn't seem to fit the actual temperatures.
Right, this is a subject of concern with a great deal of very high regarded climate scientists out there that for 42 years, this is not tracked projections, actual observation of temperatures. There's been no change to the models that to try to bring them into compliance with what we're seeing in the real world.
Okay, so what I hear you saying is that there is climate change. There's a trend, a warming trend. However, the modeling on many of the professional scientists seem to exceed that trend.
Right. Well, the way we look at that as an auditor, say that the blue jagged line is the transactions that we, you know, with various profits that we made off of transactions, and the red line is what the company booked in their books as to how much money they made. We would look at that and we would say, well, you're going to have to make an adjustment to that, and so that would actually result in a adjustment downward of what projected warming would be.
Bob, I want to be very clear about this. You're talking as a CPA on how it would audit what is actually going on out there right now.
Yeah, for a financial institution, right?
What you would do with a financial institution, and we're simply asking that climate scientists follow those same type guidelines, so that, and while there's not that accountability for the scientist, but at least we would have something that would meet a professional audit, that somebody objectively from the outside would look and go, wait a second, this makes more sense.
Yeah, I can support doing, you know, the idea of trying to do alternative energy and finding ways to reduce fossil fuels. But you're also looking at this from a standpoint of the effect, financial effect on persons.
You're getting onto my side of this. This is what I'm saying is you know, we do have things like environmental justice, and you know, there are a lot of things factoring in on the cost of energy right now, but all of them are going up. And when you start looking at trillions invested in simply carbon, there might be better ways to spend that money. Climate's going to change, and as climate's changing, we as a world population are going to have to adjust to that. And if we had that science looking at better ways to adjust, or getting at the root cause of this, and like I said, as you said, a lot of this appears to be normal transition, you know.
Yes, I mean, we want to be able to project what's going to happen in the future with climate, particularly as populations grow, and we potentially could have more impact on it. And so I was discussing this online recently with somebody and pointing out the fact that if the data was perfect that we got, in other words, if the blue line is actually perfect, okay, from that we would be able to deduce what's going on in the climate, because every little change that occurred would show up as a data point. But because there are a number of variables occurring at the same time, that doesn't always match up very well. We don't really know how to put it all together to observe how every one of the little jags that we see in the blue line affects climate. And so we know that's a change, or exactly what the factors are that change that. We don't really understand that. And if we have better monitoring, we'll have better answers.
Right. Let me get back, and we talk about satellite temperatures. These are global points that the satellite shoots to, and they've got, these are the temperature records over that course of that, what was that, 30 years or so? Yeah,
this period covers, yes, 30 years roughly.
So, but these are not, you know, where so many terrestrial places where temperatures are taken, they may change. The city builds around the airport, okay, where the, you know, normally the weather station was the airport. Now most airports are within city limits, and you've got asphalt heating, you've got who knows what. But we're talking about is satellite readings. So.
Yeah, you're talking about UHI, which is called the Urban Heat Island Effect. And with that effect, there's a lot of misunderstanding about what that means. And a lot of people would think that we're paving the earth and therefore making the earth warmer, but that's not exactly the situation. The situation is that a lot of the surface stations that are situated in cities near airports and stuff like that. And so as time has gone on, locally, small areas get warmer. It doesn't have a big effect on overall climate, but it has a big effect on monitoring the temperature of the climate.
And that, what I was exactly trying to get to was the fact that when we talk about satellite temperatures, these are points that they're consistent, okay, and the temperature reading should be consistent.
Yeah, if the airports and everything didn't change, everything would be fine. The problem is, you know, as the process of urbanization goes on, that's what causes the change in temperature.
Okay, so we've got, I mean, and you know, this gets back to like the stuff that I got on fishery management. It's like, okay, how tough could this be? This is, you know, this isn't rocket science. And the answer is no, it's actually worse. You know, there's a moving framework along the line, you know, especially with, you know, with terrestrial heating. So.
Right, yeah, being able to segregate different aspects and different variables is the real challenge. And so as we go through some of the other slides I brought here.
I was about to bring that up. Michael, could you run that second slide?
Now on the second slide here, this slide is a long-term temperature record done by the UK Met, which is their weather service in the United Kingdom. And this record goes back to, I believe it's about 1870 or something. And it shows, so you've got about 150 years of temperatures. And so the one thing
what's the total range from the top? Could you put that back on for just a second? From the top of the red to the bottom of the red, you know, what's that about? We're talking about 2 degrees?
Well, let me take a look here closer. Okay, so the scale is in 0.2 of a degree, the various tick marks. And so the entire, if you kind of take about the medium middle of that to the current thing, we're looking at about probably about 8/10 of a degree.
Okay.
Maybe a little more.
All right. So the temperature, and these are, this is a temperature record, for 175 years.
Yeah, about 150 years.
150
Oh,
years.
actually, you're correct. It's about 170. It goes back to 1850.
So anyhow, we're talking about, the outside changes, roughly the midpoint is about 0.8 degree change. So the temperature has warmed the last 175 years about 0.8 degrees.
Right, and the thing I would like to point out here on this particular graph is that if you look carefully, you'll see two trend lines. You'll see a green one and a blue one through two periods of steep warming in that curve. Now the first one is a warming trend that occurred from about 1910 to 1945, and the second one is from about 1975 to the present. And as you can see, actually the green line is a little steeper than the blue line, and they both extend close to about the same amount of warming. The problem with that is that you would say, oh, it's been warming for 110 years, looking at that, and that's true, okay? Mm-hmm. But the difficulty with that is that when you try to attribute it to CO2, and the CO2 models cannot duplicate this warming trend from 1910 to 1945.
Okay.
So there's a natural warming trend in there of roughly about the same size we've seen recently.
The same shape, anyhow.
The same shape,
yeah.
That we cannot account for what the cause is. And so one of the biggest debates in climate science is how much is natural warming and how much is anthropogenic driven warming. Mm-hmm. And so this does not tell you what the answer to that is, but what does tell you what the answer is that the models cannot reproduce this earlier term warming.
Well, the other thing it shows me is that we've got a history there that looks pretty close to the same. Now, granted, today we're 0.3 of a degree warmer or something like that than last time with that model, but the thing is the trend is not far away from the other trend.
That's correct. And so, being able to detect natural change, we're detecting natural change, it appears in this record, mm-hmm. but we don't have an explanation for it. Well, and not having an explanation for it doesn't let us be able to say that it's not occurring now.
Okay, all right. So we're kind of laying the groundwork. What about going back further?
Okay, well, if you go to slide 3, that I brought. This is a slide of a Greenland ice core record. It goes back 9,000 years. And the only thing I wanted to point out on this is that we can see that basically you go back 6,000 to 9,000 years ago, it was actually warmer than the present. And indeed, science has determined that the Arctic seas were ice-free at that point of time, and so as things are warming currently, it's possible we could get to the level of 6,000 to 9,000 years ago and have ice-free Arctic Ocean. Yeah. And very clearly, the earlier ice-free Arctic Ocean occurred naturally, and in general, we can see that. This is kind of like this whole thing coming up from the very far left-hand side. This is when we first started entering the interglacial that we call the Holocene. And we've gone through this period, and some people were suspecting we're at the end of it, we're going back towards an ice age, but nobody really understands how these occur either. There's a theory about orbit change that brings this about, but there are several variables in orbit change, and they combine in ways to make funny shapes. And so we can't depend on them just going up and going back down again. And so if we go to the fourth graph on here, this is an Antarctic ice core that goes back 450,000 years.
Okay. graph 4, Michael? There we go.
Now this one goes back 450,000 years, and we see several interglacials here in this on this slide, and so we can see that it doesn't do it evenly either. You know, we have a lot of little double peaks and big peaks and different shaped peaks and so forth back through time. And another thing to notice about the previous graph and this one also is there's a lot of jagged change in temperature that's occurring over all the time. So it's not these are not smooth lines. We see, if you look at the scale on the thing, we see that the scale, the lines, the grid lines on this scale are spaced apart by 2 degrees centigrade. And so these changes in 2 degrees centigrade, sometimes up to 4 degrees centigrade, are common within the entire ice core record.
Well, common over the period of 450,000 years.
Right.
So when we say common, you know, I mean, yes, these occur, but you know, probably not in the next couple of weeks.
No, I mean, but
yeah.
if we look at, when we look at these things, we can see that warming occurs far faster than it does when it goes into a cooling trend. You can see these really strong upticks, and then you have a gradual decline back down to another large uptick. Mm-hmm. And in the meantime, it is varying a couple of degrees one way or the other on a very dense scale here, that if you actually try to estimate what the length of the period of those 2 degree changes are, they're somewhere around about 300 or 400 years, as near as I can tell. And so saying that a 2 degree change in climate is unprecedented simply isn't supported by what data that we have.
I think that's important. I think the other thing that we have to look at is we actually, you know, we see there are normal trends out there, and the warming trend that we're looking at right now does not look out of line from other warming trends, okay? Is there a possible assist on the way with CO2? Can there be minor things that?
Yeah, I would like to, you know, point out just show that, you know, that I'm not talking about what the correct answer is here. Very, very possible the warming we have could be anthropogenic in nature. These graphs don't tell us if it is or not. It just simply tells us that there's the possibility it could be natural. We can't rule natural change out. At the same time, we can't rule out anthropogenic change either. And so this gets back to, you know, doing the research necessary to try and figure out how natural change occurs, so we can know what anthropogenic change is.
If we spent, say, the amount that is being set aside and pushed into the change right now, and carbon shunning, okay, and I'm honestly neutral on this.
Right.
But by cutting down carbon, we're looking at a cost to, I'm going to say, to humanity right now, hundreds of billions, maybe into trillions of dollars, thousands of millions of dollars.
Yeah,
could that money be better spent looking at root causes instead of simply jumping on the first bandwagon that
Well, I certainly believe that. A great deal of the money is being spent on planning for mitigation for something that's going to occur, but only potentially in one direction.
Yeah.
And while it's good to have some plans of what to happen, whether it warms or cools, you have to keep things in perspective. And if we really are serious about climate change of being a real threat, we should be spending most of our money in trying to understand exactly how it occurs better.
Understand how the natural is, and so we can define the trends that were there, create models that will mimic the natural change, the measurable change that we have there, as opposed to these are guesstimates.
Yeah, like I said, my first experience with an audit firm was working on a model for the build out of a city. And one of the things I learned in that model was that very minor changes in a lot of variables can produce astoundingly different results. And so all the stuff that we see being issued in science change is within the realm of possibility. It's just that we need to be better than that. You know, we need to be more expert at it. We need to understand what is a reasonable number and what is not a reasonable number. And until we get there, we're just guessing. And you know, while there is the potential of a threat of CO2, which I can recognize, that threat is minor compared to what we do if we make a mistake on this, you know?
Exactly. And there are opportunities right now to, it's not you say we'll throw the projects we have down the drain, but just expand them so that we take a look and find out, you know, how do you measure where we are going? And how do you model so that the models actually follow the measurements? And
right.
It seems like that's not happening.
Yeah, there needs to be well, there are a number of things have been suggested that talk about a red team approach to science, where you put together teams of scientists that are well, let me put it this way. Most scientists are thinking that CO2 is the cause of the current climate change we're seeing. But largely that's because that's what they've been taught in school. I mean, this has been a thought process that's gone on for over 100 years, you know, in school, ever since Arrhenius first proposed that CO2 could be the cause of the temperature of climate. Some of the things of the greenhouse effects were basically, well, essentially they called it a greenhouse effect, and then around the turn of the 20th century, around 1905 or somewhere, I don't know the exact, a professor, R.W. Woods, did a greenhouse experiment and showed that it wasn't radiation that created the effect in a greenhouse. And that's my experience in solar energy also. And but that didn't change the thought process. They developed a theory that's more complex than a greenhouse. And the unfortunate thing about this theory, it's not really well described, and there isn't any way to test it. And so, so there's no way to, you know, create a lapse rate. It depends on a lapse rate, and lapse rates are important in terms.
What is a lapse rate?
Well, the lapse rate is, you know, that's a thing in meteorology, is that as you go up in the atmosphere, the temperature drops because the pressure drops in the atmosphere, and there's a constant movement of air between layers. And so the lapse rate, you have two different lapse rates. You have the dry lapse rate without water, and then you have one with water. Now CO2 itself doesn't change the lapse rate because it doesn't change phases. You know, it doesn't become liquid or a gas. It's a gas all the time. Whereas with water, it goes up as a vapor, evaporates out of the ocean, and goes up as a vapor, and then condenses in the sky and becomes water, and then it falls as rain. Forms clouds first, and then falls as rain. So the clouds you see up in the sky are water. The water you don't see in the sky is water vapor. There's a lot of water vapor in the sky, but you see right through that, and just like you see through the CO2.
Okay. At least we got a rough idea of lapse rates. I didn't mean to interrupt you from where we were before saying the differences in lapse rate.
Yeah, in my view, probably, this is what I think, is that, and this is just an opinion, is that the changing in temperature that we see is probably due to changes in water vapor. Mm-hmm. Now that leads to, well, what changes the water vapor? Well, the global warming theory is that CO2 provides a slight amount of warming, and that changes the amount of water vapor in the atmosphere. And but there are other factors at play here. We have the sun that changes its frequency of radiation. There are lots of things that we don't understand real well about water. There are huge gaps, and water is not evenly distributed in the atmosphere. You can tell that just by looking up, and either you see a cloud or you don't see a cloud. And like a 1% change in cloud cover could account for all the warming we've seen. So
because of the reflective nature of clouds?
Well, clouds do two things. They both reflect heat back from the top of the clouds back to space before they get to the surface, and they also reflect heat back down to the surface from the ground. So they have a greenhouse effect also, and that is very poorly understood, what the role of clouds are in climate change and how much they change. Now, the assumptions in climate change is these things don't change when the cloud level doesn't change. It's just the amount of water vapor that changes. And in that way, you can get the largest amount of change out of that. And so that's somewhat manipulating the variables to get the worst possible outcome.
Okay. And CO2, colorless, odorless, basically not reflective and not...
That's correct, yeah.
Okay.
Sunlight shines down through it, and then the light that is emitted by the surface, which we can't see because it's in infrared frequencies, are blocked by CO2. Now, if CO2 was really thin in the atmosphere, then it could have much more warming potential, because it's the blocking of frequencies that really create a very definite greenhouse effect. Now, but you also need to have something that you are up in the sky. You need some warmth up there as well, because like if there isn't any warmth in the air, there would be no back radiation back to the surface by the CO2. And so what warms the air in the atmosphere is, and I'm getting into a lot of detail here, which I really didn't mean to do, is that it gets very complex, in terms of how much and the ability of things to warm. I'm kind of a believer in a single layer, what they call a single layer greenhouse effect, and yet that's the greenhouse, that is actually the greenhouse model, the original one. And now it's considered to be a multi-layer effect, but they don't explain how the heat gets back down through multiple layers. And so there are gaps in our knowledge about exactly how the greenhouse effect works.
Bob, we're getting in, this is an incredibly complex problem.
Yes, it is.
And first of all, while we might question how some of the science has evolved, we're not really questioning the scientists. They're all, none of them are out there trying to do a bad job.
No, I don't think so. I mean, there has been some controversy over some papers that have been done over time, and a lot of it, there's a certain amount of salesmanship that's going on in all this. I mean, there's a lot of money changing hands, and that's just natural. And so, but it isn't audited in a sense. There isn't any liability attached to, exaggerating what your viewpoint is, and for either direction, to tell the truth. Yeah. And so, it's really a key getting down to finding out what the actual facts are, and that leads you to some very interesting other stuff into what is the threat of not doing something immediately, and that has been largely overstated as well. This is an IPC. You can look at the papers of the IPCC. Is that it would take about, if there's a perturbation, like we do emissions into the atmosphere over a period of time, and then we discontinued those emissions, it would take about 30 years to get about halfway back. In other words, we've raised over the last 150 years, it's thought that we've raised the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere by probably about 30% or something or other. I don't have the number right at my hand, but we've raised it about 30% since about 1870. And so if we stopped, like today, emitting fossil fuels, we would get rid of like 60 of those 120 some odd parts, okay? about half of it in 30 years.
Right, and you're saying 30%. This isn't 30% CO2 in the atmosphere. What's the percentage of CO2 in the atmosphere?
Oh, it's a very small percentage. It's like 400 parts per million.
400 parts per million.
Mm-hmm.
So it's up 30%. So it went from 300 parts per million to 400, roughly.
280 parts per million, I believe, is considered to be the starting point of anthropogenic warming. And it's currently at 400, so it's added about 120 parts per million. And so if we were to all of a sudden stop, within 30 years we'd be back to where we were 30 or 40 years ago.
In the 1950s.
Yeah.
So interesting. If you were going to draw a diagram, how would you diagram your way out of this thing? This is a crazy problem. Are there solutions?
Well, in terms of what we're looking at about taking action now, I mean, like I say, I spent a long time doing this back in the 1970s of installing various passive solar energy things. And I think the people that have the wherewithal, okay, I really think they can benefit from actually taking advantage of some of these technologies, and it's not done very much, okay? And the people that can afford it can do a lot, but it's not really happening. So maybe there needs to be some incentives to do that. Who it hurts the most is the poorest people, the people that don't have their own homes, that can't do the kinds of architecture and technical work that would, over the long term, reduce their energy use.
Okay, and we have two issues. One, there is a gradual trend of global warming.
Yes.
Okay, and to deal with that, it's going to take resources. And the thing I see and the problem I see is the current path is investing incredible amounts of resources into trying to fix that, but it's ready, fire, aim.
Yeah.
You're not sure what you're shooting at.
That's right.
And if it was in a small caliber, it's not so bad. But we're talking about something that's going to impact every human being on this planet. It would be good to get it at least close to right, and perhaps it is. But from what I'm seeing on those graphs, is this is completely an unknown, and it's not out of line from what we've seen in the natural warming trends with our planet.
Yes, that's correct. You can't rule out nature being the predominant driver of all this. And so when you look at the various graphs I showed, is that first of all we have projections of warming much greater than what is actually occurring, number one. So you might take half of it away for that. And then if you want to try to balance the act, you can take another half away, for being natural and anthropogenic. Now some would argue that, some of this natural stuff is actually causing cooling. And so that, puts more onus on CO2. Well, these are science issues that haven't been well fleshed out in terms of what the answers are.
Ready, fire, aim.
Right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And what would be where would be a good place for this research to start? Is there some place that I see universities, and again, look, this is not to condemn universities. They do what they can, it's publish or perish. But the dollars seem to come in if you're doing something, anti-carbon, and actually, how do we get a change in focus? Is there a way of, would you suggest some type of a way of taking a broader look at the situation to how do we get there?
Well, I kind of have been a fan of what they call the red team approach that was proposed a number of years ago to try to put teams together to come up with, I mean, I work at the Pacific Council, and that's a process whereby stakeholders sit down with managers and scientists and stuff like that, look at the type of issues that are there, and hash out solutions that work for everybody. Or and some of it's painful to some of us. Like I was mentioning that people that have money can actually do things today to save on their own. Not expect somebody to do it for them, and actually make a difference themselves. And I think over the long run, it actually makes them money if they're wise in their investment. I mean, there's a lot of charlatans out there that will try to sell you a system, that overpriced system and stuff like that. So it requires a little research and some expertise in determining whether you're getting your money's worth. But very definitely, if you go if you're frugal and you put in a smart system, you can actually save money today. But then it requires your own home. You have to be a homeowner in order to really take advantage of this stuff. And people that are building new custom homes have even more opportunities to do this, at relatively low cost. You can't redesign homes today. It costs a lot of money to redesign them architecturally. Now this is one of these things I like to call a lost art. Before fossil fuels came along many years ago, going all the way back to the ancient Egyptians, they understood passive solar energy, and much of their architecture was designed around it. And there's even, you can go to early America there, and I've seen this, in a photograph, is that Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid had a hideout in the West here, and they actually had a passive solar energy system.
It was on the south side of the hill.
Yeah, they had a passive, they had a big 10 water tank sitting up on top of their bathroom, basically, and so they had hot water,
Yeah.
and it was all solar provided. And so these things are relatively easy to do, but they're not cheap. They cost you a few $1,000s, to put them up. But it's quite amazing how much money you can potentially save with these things over the long period of time.
I just think that, possibly, instead of generating carbon credits, investing in something like this would have a much greater effect on the long term than where we're going right now.
Right. I mean, yeah, exactly. If you have people that are installing these things, that can help some. And continuing some research on alternative energies to find better batteries and so forth, so these things can be more dependable and not so expensive in terms of maintenance and other things. We can eventually get away from fossil fuels. Considering nuclear energy again would be a very good avenue that's been proven by a number of nations that are highly dependent upon nuclear energy. And so there are alternatives. We just have to make the decisions of choosing paths that make economic sense.
I keep coming back to our courses of study and your red team concept. I mean, this can't be a few guys sitting around a conference table. This has got to be. I mean, we're talking about, how do you really look out for, what's going on in the world, and then how does that team ensure that it gets that message out on a broad basis, because there is so much invested in the other side right now. I'm not sure the answer on that one.
I'm not sure either, but it is a public policy thing, and I think it makes a whole lot of sense for people to, grasp it. There are a number of public policy initiatives. I'd love to talk about the Pacific Council and the Magnuson Act.
Pacific Fisheries Management Council, and we are blessed here in the United States. That council system works pretty well, and Bob, and I've said this before a lot of times, and absolutely mean it. The work that you've done over the past 25 years on the Pacific Council has helped bring it along on a number of areas.
Well, it's been in the last. They passed the Sustainable Fisheries Act in 1996, I believe.
Yep.
And it was only a year or two after that I got involved with this. and over the time we have proven beyond any doubt that we can manage fisheries. And we have managed them, and the National Marine Fisheries Service has done has a fantastic record of turning around overfished
Bob,
species.
this is done incredibly well, because in '96 they put teeth in the enforcement, and that seemed to change the entire spectrum. And that's, you know, and that's kind of what I'm trying to carry over to what we're saying right now. Are there ways that we can kind of broaden the look that we're taking? And this is not to say, hey, look, let's drop everything on carbon credits and everything else, but let's make sure that they're correct. And how do you broaden that out? And maybe it is Red Team, and maybe it is something like the Pacific Council, because everything is open and notorious there, you know, and that's what we need is a really good open dialogue on this. And also at the same time, ensure that this dialogue is spread far and wide so that anybody can comment on it, but also the fact that it gets some traction so that we can actually get some of the stuff in play.
Yeah, we need to find solutions that brings everybody along on this thing, and is fair, you know, to people.
Amen.
I mean, gas prices today are just killing some people. You know, it is brutal, and we need to think about those things when we move forward, and what the effect is on. I mean, bottom line is I've learned is that really conservation is a luxury. You know, if you have the economic power to do that, hey, do it, you know, but don't ruin the economic power.
Yeah, well, I've always felt that conservation is the wise use of resources, and that kind of fits in there somewhere. And that's truly what we're looking at as far as solutions in this audit of climate change. I mean, how do we move ahead wisely? How do we do things that make sense today and well into the future? And, you know, the thing is, if you're missing by a little bit right now, by the time you get out there, you're way, way off target, and that's the thing that worries me. So, Bob Osborn, I think I hear the music. We're getting out of here. Thanks so much. This has really been a great lesson in auditing climate.
Okay, thank you.
I would bet that Michael's going to bring